Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Sonia, and I have the absolute pleasure of introducing you all to our last and the new speaker of the night, Jameel Jaffer. Jameel Jaffer is the inaugural executive director of the Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia University. Under his leadership, this institute has worked tirelessly to defend the freedoms of speech and the press in the digital era, and has established important precedents regarding the free speech rights of foreign citizens and the right of the public to access government documents. Before launching the Knight Institute in 2016, Jaffer was a litigator at the ACLU. In this role, he led instrumental post-9/11 litigation teams that brought the Bush administration to disclose the Office of Legal Counsel's torture memos and the Obama administration to disclose the OLC's drone memos. He also played a key role in the ACLU's decision to represent Edward Snowden, a former American intelligence contractor who exposed classified information about global surveillance programs. Tonight's discussion will be moderated by the Executive Director of the Goldfarb Center for Public Affairs, Alison Bie, and Kelvin Owusu, a senior studying computer science and mathematics. Please join me in welcoming our amazing speaker tonight, Jameel Jaffer. Thank you.
So, Jameel, very happy to have you.
Very happy to be here.
Thank you. I'm so glad. I just need to let you all know that Jameel and I know each other from ACLU days. He was at National, I was at the ACLU of Maine. This is one of the biggest brains that you will meet in a long time. Being a constitutional lawyer and then being a First Amendment lawyer, there are very few in the country. We're very happy you're here. However, I have also warned him that because constitutional law is so complicated, it doesn't lend itself to quick answers. But I am going to try to keep him tight, okay? We're gonna try to get a lot of questions. So he knows that my job here, if we go too far, I'm gonna rein him back in. So we have consent for the situation that's about to happen, I hope. So, Jameel, it's wonderful to have you in Maine. Thank you.
Thank you for the invitation. It's great to see so many of you here.
Great.
Thanks for coming.
So I think we are here to talk about free speech, AI, surveillance, all those things, but I want to take us back to the very beginning. What is it about free speech? The Constitution says that the government shall make no law abridging freedom of speech. It's become a hallmark of our democracy, hallmark of American culture, and yet speech is actually really dangerous. It causes incredible harm. It can harm communities, it can harm individuals, it can harm government. So why do we actually think free speech is something that's so important? Why do we protect this?
Well, so there are multiple reasons, but I think the most important one you already mentioned, Allison, in your wind-up there. I think free speech is crucial to democracy. That we protect free speech because that's the way democracy works. The only way that we can hold the government accountable is to be able to talk to one another about government policy, talk to one another about the government's decisions, organize collectively, decide together what we want the government's policies to be, and then advocate for change. And all of that is free speech. And we protect all of that so that we, the people, can keep control of the government rather than the other way around. And that's kind of just a very basic idea, which I think is maybe the most important idea in American democracy, this idea that we're in charge of the government and not the other way around. And it's free speech that makes that happen.
So, but you know, so much of the speech, we can have hate speech is protected. We can have, I mean, there's so much of it. Tell me about how do we respond to the fact that there is real harm that's caused? You talk about the positives. Yeah. But how do we respond to what the consequences can be?
Yeah, well, so, you know, one response is that not all speech is protected. There are limits to the First Amendment. There are, you know, certain kinds of speech like threats, true threats, or you know, fighting words, or certain kinds of speech that are beyond the protection of the First Amendment. Obscenity is another category. But within very broad parameters, we protect speech principally because we think the risks of allowing the government to regulate it outweigh the dangers that the speech might cause. And that's always a kind of contested question, you know, whether we're drawing that line in the right, you know, in the right place. There has, for many decades, been a dispute over whether hate speech should be protected or not. I grew up in Canada where hate speech isn't constitutionally protected. There are laws that make it illegal to draw hatred to a particular, that's not the phrase in the law, but basically to subject a particular class of people on the basis of race or religion to hatred. All of that is illegal in Canada. It's illegal in most of Europe, but it's legal here in the United States. And that is a hotly contested question, whether that line is drawn in the United States in the right place. And there are many other areas where we protect speech more broadly here in the United States than they do in most other democracies. Campaign finance, this is a shorthand, but in the United States, money is considered speech. Contributions to political campaigns are considered speech, and they're constitutionally protected. That doesn't mean they can't be regulated, but it means that it's harder to regulate them. And that distinguishes the United States from many other democracies. So, we protect this very broad spectrum of speech because we are very committed to this idea that the people should get to decide what the government should look like. And in order to decide what the government should look like, we need to be able to say things that are controversial, that other people disagree with. And there are many instances, many examples throughout our history of the government, the federal government, state governments, local governments, using even limited power to regulate speech in ways that ends up suppressing legitimate political dissent. And so we tend to be kind of allergic here to this idea of government regulation of speech.
Okay, you're doing a great job. Just what you know, keeping
Thank
that.
you.
So
Thank
good
you.
work. And someone should ask him about Citizens United, by the way, because he just referenced campaign finance, and I know we've talked about that. So someone do that. And I also, one more thing. I just want you to know we're going to try a little differently. We're going to go to student questions almost right away, and then ping pong. So everyone get ready. Calvin.
Yeah, so along the
Oh,
lines...
I need mics. That's what I just meant to say. Mics, please. Sorry, go ahead.
So along the lines of free speech being an important part of democracy, our Corby campus thrives on diverse perspective from international students to domestic students who are deeply involved in political conversations. We've also seen government actions like ideological deportation policies, which are aimed at non-citizen protesters, and these are leaving these students with a chilling effect, and they are scared of being deported for having a political opinion or engaging in democratic process. And you are a front line in arguing that First Amendment protects all individuals regardless of their citizenship status. So can you explain what free speech means in practice for international students and democratic students, and how government interventions are changing the way students feel safe engaging in these political conversations?
Yeah, I mean, this is a huge question right now for reasons you've already alluded to, but it's been a big question throughout American history. So this is something that you may not know if you haven't studied the First Amendment, but the First Amendment was basically dormant until the beginning of the 20th century. It didn't mean anything until 1919. And after the First World War, or during the First World War, and in the years immediately after the First World War, the government started to charge people under the Espionage Act for protesting the war or for protesting the draft. And the government also started to round up immigrants, mostly Russian immigrants, Italians, Jewish immigrants, and started to deport them on the theory that they were anarchists or communists. And this question came up right away, right at the beginning of the development of the First Amendment. Who is the First Amendment for? Who's it supposed to protect? Is it supposed to protect American citizens, or is it supposed to protect everybody? Or is that just not the right way of thinking about the First Amendment at all, and it's supposed to protect a process instead? It's really about the democratic process and only secondarily about people. So that question has been, with us for 100 years now. But now we have an administration, the Trump administration, that is very aggressive in using the immigration laws as a mechanism for censorship. And one respect in which they're doing that is by targeting international students, foreign students and foreign faculty who are here in the United States, initially targeting them because of their involvement in pro-Palestinian protest or their alleged involvement in pro-Palestinian protest. But more recently, it's actually been a much broader category. We represent researchers, technology researchers who study the social media platforms, and some of them have criticized the policies of social media platforms that President Trump is close to. So criticize X, for example. And the Trump administration has responded by revoking their visas or denying them visas to enter the country if they're not in the country already. And so this is it's not unprecedented. Like I said, we've had stuff like this for 100 years. It's, sort of gone up and down. But I would say it's more aggressive now than it has been in the last 50 years. And we have First Amendment law now that is supposed to protect non-citizens in the United States. There's good First Amendment law that says, essentially, the First Amendment protects everyone, not just citizens, but non-citizens as well. The problem is there's this huge disconnect between the law as it exists on paper and the law as it exists in the real world. Because right now you can see that people are being thrown behind bars for engaging in political protest. And I think that eventually that gap is going to close. The courts are going to reaffirm the protections that non-citizens have. But it's going to take a few years for that to happen. And in the meantime, I think that there is, I see this at Columbia, a real chilling effect on the willingness of non-citizen students and faculty to engage in political protest, or even, even to do things like write letters to the editor or attend particular, forums in which particularly controversial issues are being discussed. And I think that's such a sad thing, not just for those people who are denied, the rights that the First Amendment is supposed to protect, but for all of us, because we're all denied the participation of those people, right? When somebody's silenced, it's not just that they're silenced, it means that we can't hear what they have to say. So there are costs on both sides. And I think that these policies of targeting foreign students and foreign faculty for their speech have had tremendous costs, not just for the people who are silenced, but for our democracy.
Great. Let's do this. I want to get back to this issue of whether Trump's policies are, administrations always try to silence opposition, right? So is this really different or not? I know you have thoughts on that. Before that, let's go to Nabila first to do a first question, and then we'll see what else is coming up for everyone. I want to get everyone on their toes. All right, let's go.
Hi, thank you so much for coming to Colby. My name is Nabila Ali, and I'm a freshman. So since you've started the talk with people's freedom of speech and the First Amendment, I wanted to pull the example of when government officials are pressing social media companies to put down misleading false information on their platforms. What are you gonna say about when it comes to AI-generated deep fakes? Where is the line between when the government tries to protect the public from receiving truthful information and the First Amendment rights when they are dictating what information is true?
Yeah. Great question. So I think that there's actually a whole set of questions related to the privatization of the public square. So it used to be that when we had conversations about the government or conversations about public policy, they would take place sort of paradigmatically in parks or on city streets. It was in public spaces. That's where we would meet, or we would meet in town halls or city council meetings. And now increasingly, these conversations that used to take place in those places are taking place on these privately owned platforms instead. And that means that the owners of those platforms have a lot of power to influence what speech is permissible and who gets to speak and which ideas get heard, especially which ideas get heard, right? I think there's sometimes not enough emphasis put on that because there's always a lot of debate about deplatforming, like who should be on these platforms and who shouldn't be on the platforms. But really, the more important decision is not about who's on or who's off. It's about amplification, because the platforms, as you know, decide not only who's on the platform, but whose speech gets heard. And that's a lot of power. And these platforms are owned by a relatively small number of people who are not accountable to the democratic public. They're accountable to their shareholders, and often not even to their shareholders, because they are the majority. They hold all the voting stock in their companies. So that means that private power is playing a different role now in public discourse than was the case 20 years ago, or 100 years ago. The whole set of hard free speech questions about that. But one of them comes from what you were pointing out. These platforms are kind of gatekeepers to public discourse, and so they're very tempting targets for governments that want to shape public discussion. Like, if the government doesn't like what people are saying, it no longer has to pass a law that says you can't say it. Instead, they just call up the platform and say, listen, can you take down this speech, or can you stop amplifying that kind of speech? And this has been a problem. This was a problem before the Trump administration came along. The Biden administration had a ton of engagement with the platforms around public health, right, around COVID. And my view is that all of this was well-intentioned, that they thought that there was a lot of misinformation on the platform. There was a lot of misinformation on the platforms, and they thought it was their obligation to make sure that the public was getting accurate information about public health and about COVID and about the vaccines. And so what they would do is they would call up the platforms and say, can you take this kind of stuff down? And when the platforms wouldn't do it, they would become a little bit more aggressive and say, if you don't take it down, we're going to embarrass you publicly. And then even more aggressive and say, if you don't take it down, not only are we going to embarrass you publicly, but we're going to pass laws that make your life difficult. And again, I think it was at least mostly well-intentioned, but at a certain point it became, I think, not just persuasion but coercion. It became the government effectively doing informally what it's not constitutionally permitted to do. Like, it's not, you couldn't pass a law that said platforms can't publish what they want to about vaccines. But in effect, the government was going to the platforms and saying, you can't publish what you want to about vaccines. And now the Trump administration has really amped that up. And the Trump administration is doing this like it's on steroids, not just with the platforms, but with major media companies like ABC and CBS and CNN. The Trump administration is strong-arming them, not passing laws, but basically threatening them and intimidating them so that they will take down speech that the Trump administration doesn't like. Jimmy Kimmel is the most recent example, right? This instance in which Kimmel told a joke, maybe a joke in bad taste, and Trump didn't like it, and so he demanded that Kimmel be fired, and the FCC has now initiated, the Federal Communications Commission has initiated an investigation to try to pull the licenses that Disney and ABC rely on. And the First Amendment knows what to do when the government passes a law that says you can't say this. But the truth is the First Amendment doesn't actually know what to do when the government tries to do informally what it couldn't do formally. And this is an area where First Amendment doctrine is evolving very quickly, because the courts are trying to figure out how to draw a line between permissible government persuasion, because nobody wants to stop the government from trying to persuade other people that what they're saying is wrong, but drawing a line between persuasion and impermissible coercion. Sorry, this is a very long answer.
No. Can I follow up on that, though? So you've gone after, Obama administration, Biden, Trump, but do you feel, is this just a logical extension, or is this different? I mean, have other administrations asked their agencies to actually, because we've got different things. We've got a law, which you said is clear for the First Amendment. They know what the First Amendment. I love talking about the First Amendment as an embodied being, like the First Amendment knows what to do. But you do that, that's fine, but what about this idea of asking, I mean, isn't that permissible for the president to say, I want the FCC to investigate? I mean, where, is that really going so far beyond what other administrations have done?
I think it is going, so you're right. I spent 8 years litigating against the Bush administration and then 8 years litigating against the Obama administration. And now I litigate against the Trump administration. And, I do my best to be principled and sort of take the same positions in, no matter who the defendant is on the other side. I'm sure that, I haven't always been as principled as I wanted to be, but I try to be principled. I do think this administration is different not just from Biden and Obama and Bush, but different from any administration that we've had since the First Amendment came into being 100 years ago. I think this administration poses a kind of threat to free speech values and institutions that are important to democracy that no administration before it, at least, not since 1919, has posed. And I think that, the analogy that sometimes people offer, they say, well, surely things were worse during the McCarthy era, right? This isn't as bad as the McCarthy era. And I think my view is it's worse. It's worse because as powerful as Senator McClellan, who has the same kinds of instincts with respect to free speech, but has much, much more power. And I think that President Trump is using that power very, very aggressively. I mentioned the deportation of students on the basis of speech, but there's everything from expelling the Associated Press from the White House press pool because it's unwilling to call the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America. Shutting down the Pentagon's press pool just a few months ago, demanding outrageous settlements from media organizations like ABC and CBS for lawsuits that would never have gone anywhere in court, but just sort of coercing them into making these huge payments. I think if you put all this together, I think it really is quite different from anything that we have confronted in modern American history. Can I say one more thing, even though I've gone on? It's an important
Well,
point.
I'm just as bad because I added a question, so yeah.
Okay.
But I'm going to turn
So,
back. Okay, go ahead.
but I actually think the really dangerous thing isn't so much what the Trump administration is doing, although those things are dangerous. I think the really demoralizing thing has been the way that powerful institutions have responded to the Trump administration's threats. Because the First Amendment is actually a very powerful tool now. It wasn't in 1919, but it is now. If the government is targeting you for your speech, the First Amendment is an extremely powerful defense, whether you are a student on campus or you are one of the nation's largest media organizations. But so many of the nation's most powerful institutions have not actually asserted their First Amendment rights. I mean, I mentioned that these major media organizations just settling with the Trump administration. Universities have settled with the Trump administration, agreed not to teach certain things or not to hire certain people or not to admit certain kinds of students, rather than suing or rather than defending themselves with the First Amendment in court. And I think that if we're going to sort of move beyond this dangerous moment, it's going to require a kind of civic courage that we haven't seen a lot of.
More than just you at the Knight Center, right? So I want Kelvin to have a next question, and do we have an audience question? Okay, see, you guys, you sit in the front row, you get asked, because that's, Lillian, do you want to go? And then Kelvin,
Yep.
Okay?
Thank you so much, Professor, for being here. I'm curious about your view on the recent protests at Columbia University in support of Palestine. Do you think or do you see them as effective forms of political expression, or what impact do you think they have?
Well, let me answer an easier question first, okay? So I think that most of what took place on Columbia's campus was constitutionally protected speech, and that was true even of protests that violated university rules. I say most because there were instances in which speech was, I think, fairly characterized as harassment or intimidation and threatening. But most of it wasn't like that. Most of it was actually very peaceful, same kind of protests, and in fact, in most ways more peaceful than the protests that took place against South Africa in the 1980s and the protests that took place against the Vietnam War in the late 1960s. On Columbia's campus, hundreds of students were arrested in those protests in 1968. There are lots of students who were beaten by the police in 1968, students who were violent against the police in 1968. So, by comparison, what took place on Columbia's campus was actually relatively peaceful. Now, you asked a different question. You asked whether it was effective, and I'm not sure that I'm the best person to try to answer that question, but I'll just say that effective at what? I think that protests can be really important to building solidarity. Sometimes people feel like they're alone in their reactions to a particular injustice, and it's a kind of galvanizing thing to know that other people are also outraged at what they're at what they're seeing. I think protests are very important for that reason. Protests can draw public attention to an issue, and I think these ones did. I think protests alone are rarely enough to change the world. You need so many other things, including other forms of speech, and protests probably don't often change people's minds. Like, if you want to change somebody's mind, you have to argue with them, or you have to show them things they haven't seen before, right? That's not to diminish the importance of protests. It's just that they can't do everything.
Yeah, so in the spirit of talking about the recent protest that happened at Columbia University, which led to the arrest of some of the students, what happens to American universities when students are scared of their digital footprint, that if I make a post today, there might be some companies spying on the information that I'm posting, and that could be given to the government, and that could land me into trouble?
Yeah. This is an important thing, that now there's this kind of connection between private surveillance and government power. Like, the government relies very heavily, not just in this context, but in many other contexts now, on surveillance conducted by either private corporations or private advocacy groups, or in this particular instance with the protests at Columbia, there are these advocacy groups that identified students who, in the view of these advocacy groups, were anti-Semitic or anti-Israel, and they gave those names to the Department of Homeland Security and the State Department, which then arrested them, threw them in jail, and threatened them with deportation. And this is a particularly extreme instance of it, but this kind of thing, in the sense of private collection of data shared with the government, which then acts in ways that deprive people of liberty or deprive people of liberty, that is a much bigger issue. Much bigger issue. All sorts of major technology companies now, right, are contractors for the government. They engage in surveillance of what we do on social media, or they collect location information, or collect financial information, and then they share it with the government, which then acts in ways that are sometimes have really profound implications for people's lives. And the collection is almost entirely invisible. The role of the private corporations is almost entirely invisible because the private corporations aren't subject to the kinds of oversight mechanisms that the government is. Like you can't file a Freedom of Information Act request with Palantir. You can file one with the government, but the government's not the one doing the collection, right? The government is just like buying information from Palantir or from a million other technology companies. And this is another area where I think constitutional law needs to catch up with technology.
Okay. I'm going to, I was told by a faculty that you have to just pause. I see a couple back there, and I'm definitely, Rebecca, right there. And I know Reeve is, also.
Hi, I'm Reeve. Thank you so much for being here today. I was really interested in a lot of your work on the American government's reaction to 9/11 and sort of like a lot of drastic policies that came from that, especially with Guantanamo Bay, which has been shrouded in so much secrecy in recent years, with seemingly indefinite prison tenures for the detainees staying there, sometimes up to 2 or 3 decades. And I really wanted to ask you to what extent you think the secrecy around a lot of these policies is actually justified, like the American government claims they're doing, like as if they're actually protecting American people, whereas they're just used to hide secrets from us.
Yeah. So there are people out there who think that government secrecy is sort of generally illegitimate, just sort of across the board. And for a while, WikiLeaks was one of these organizations that, sort of radical transparency organization. They just thought the world would be better if all of this information were public. And I don't agree with that particular way of looking at things. I think that there are certain kinds of information that, at least for a particular period of time, the government has a legitimate interest in keeping secret. Information about where we're going to use military force, in the near future, is information that I think the government has. At least if it's specific enough, the government has a legitimate interest in keeping secret. Maybe the technical specifications or of particular kinds of weapons, the government has a legitimate interest in keeping secret. But a lot of the stuff that the government kept secret in the years after 9/11, and this was true of the Bush administration, but also true of the Obama administration, a lot of it wasn't analogous to what I just described. It was policy level information, or it was legal analysis. It was, like, for example, the legal justifications for the use of torture against prisoners in CIA black sites. Right? There were these legal memos that the Bush administration wrote to make it possible for interrogators to torture prisoners. And then it kept the legal memos secret from the public. And keeping the legal memo secret from the public didn't serve any legitimate national security interest. It just prevented outside legal experts from saying this is a bogus explanation, that your interpretation of this statute, the torture statute, is indefensible. And I think the same thing was true with the Obama administration and the drone memos. When the Obama administration started carrying out drone strikes in half a dozen countries, on the theory that it was targeting militants or terrorists, it too wrote these legal memos. It's an office called the Office of Legal Counsel in the Justice Department, wrote these legal memos that purported to provide the kind of legal authorization for these strikes. And it kept those memos secret, not because there was anything particularly sensitive in them, but because keeping them secret made it harder for people outside the government to hold the government accountable for its decisions, to say, your argument is inconsistent with the due process clause, or your argument is inconsistent with international law. It's much harder to say that if you don't know what the argument is. And now the Trump administration is just using the same secrecy justifications that the Bush and the Obama administrations used to keep secret the memos that are justifying these boat strikes, where they're carrying out the killings of suspected drug dealers. The legal basis for those strikes is secret. And I don't think that there's any legitimate government interest in keeping those secret. It's just an effort to kind of disable the process of the sort of accountability mechanisms that would otherwise kick in.
Great. William? I see Sonia, William. I don't know if there was other here too.
Hi there. Thank you for joining us. My name is William. I'm a senior majoring in economics. You started off by talking about how the First Amendment makes sure that we're all informed citizens, and that helps function, or helps our democracy function. It sounds like you represented Edward Snowden, who sort of shed light on a lot of government surveillance that was taking place, but it seems like government surveillance hasn't slowed down despite public outcry at that time. I'm wondering how you see that First Amendment sort of like shedding light on classified information. It's having an impact on society now, particularly since we haven't seen a slowdown in government surveillance since then.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that it's, you're right that government surveillance has, expanded in so many different ways, but there are ways in which it did slow down after the Snowden disclosures. Like, for example, some of the disclosures related to what people call the call records program, which was, the government kept track of every time you picked up the phone, any of us picked up the phone, there was a record made of, who we were calling, how long the call took, just metadata, not the content of the call, but all the metadata relating to the call was tracked and kept in a massive government database. And all of that was happening for many years before Snowden disclosed what he disclosed. But once he disclosed it, I was at the ACLU at the time, we were able to go to court and challenge that program, and the court struck it down, and then Congress changed the law. And that program has been shut down. There are a few other programs like that that have been shut down. There's also a lot more transparency about certain kinds of government surveillance than there was before. So I think that Snowden's disclosures did actually have a significant effect on both government policy and how much we know about government policy. That said, I think the broader picture is the one you describe. I mean, partly because technology has evolved so quickly. And the law is, unfortunately and inevitably slow. It just takes a long time for all of us to get our heads around new technologies and how those technologies should be regulated, and we often get it wrong initially, and then we have to go back and change the law and try to get it right, and that just takes time. And in the meantime, technology continues to evolve, and this sort of radical expansion in the capabilities of surveillance technology is something that, by surveillance technology, I mean to encompass AI. Is something that the law still hasn't, figured out how to deal with.
I think, Leo, we've got three right here, but I haven't seen you ask a question, have I? So let's go there first.
Hi, my name is Grace. I'm a sophomore, history and science and technology society major. And my question has to do with election misinformation and kind of thinking about how important the First Amendment rights are to protecting democracy, but also considering how election misinformation undermines democracy. So how should the government legislate to prevent election misinformation while preserving First Amendment rights?
Yeah. So I agree with you that misinformation can be hugely damaging, and especially misinformation relating to elections. I also think it's important to recognize that misinformation is to a large extent just a kind of inevitable byproduct of a system in which ordinary people get to decide what's true and what's false, right? There are systems in which the government says, this is what's true and that's what's false. And in those systems, there's nothing like, there's no misinformation, right? And we have quite deliberately decided we're not going to have that kind of system. We're going to have a system in which we all get to decide what's true and what's false. And so to some extent, the problem of misinformation just comes with the territory. It's just inseparable from a commitment to free speech and democracy, like these things that we're not going to give up, right? So then if we're not going to give those things up, we have to accept, to some extent, misinformation. Now, to accept it doesn't necessarily, by accept, I just mean we're not going to pass laws to make it illegal. But there are lots of other things we can do, right? Like we can create institutions that are intended to correct misinformation, like fact-checking institutions or expert institutions that publish reports and say, this is what vaccines really do, or this is what, I don't know, these are, these are the results of nuclear weapons, or, we can have experts, empower experts to explain to others what the truth really is. Now, it's not going to be perfect, in part because the experts will sometimes get things wrong, right? And this is one thing that I think, was really highlighted during the pandemic. I said earlier that I thought the Biden administration's efforts were like sort of good, made in good faith, and I do. I think that they were well-intentioned, that they tried to protect people from what they saw as misinformation. And often what they were doing was protecting people from misinformation, but not always. Sometimes they got it wrong. They thought that some of the things that they thought were false were actually true, and vice versa. There were some confusion about masks at the beginning, for example, right? One consequence of having a system in which the government doesn't get to say what's true and what's false is that certain kinds of dangerous misinformation take root and end up damaging, doing real damage. But another consequence is that it's possible to correct, right? When the government gets things wrong, there are going to be other people who say the government is wrong. And then hopefully public discourse kind of moves in the direction of, over time, moves in the direction of truth. There's a certain amount of, there's an element of faith in it, I think, that over time we will learn. And candidly, it's sort of harder to hold on to that faith in the environment we're in, but that kind of faith that over time, an open debate in which all views can be aired and tested will lead us to something closer to truth is kind of what's at the heart of the First Amendment. And if you look back at the decisions that Justices Oliver Wendell Holmes and Louis Brandeis wrote in 1919 and in the years immediately after, that's kind of the theory that they're putting out there. Like they're not saying the world is going to be a perfect place if we allow all speech to flourish. So they're just saying, look, we have two options. Give the government the power to dictate what's true and what's false, or try to figure it out ourselves. And between those options, it's better to try to figure it out ourselves and hope that over time we learn from our mistakes and we correct ourselves.
Great. I think Leo?
Hi, my name's Leo. I'm a freshman. I was going to ask a little bit about what you mentioned earlier, which was surveillance and AI and kind of how those intertwine. And something that I've heard, and I'm curious to get your thoughts on this, is that there's a lot of information that's collected by the government that they could do a lot more with. They just don't have the manpower to. And with more AI automation, they could be able to track a lot more of our daily lives. Mm-hmm. And I know this is one of the reasons that Anthropic split with the Pentagon, and it was because they didn't want their technology used for this kind of mass surveillance. So I'm curious where you think that's going to go, if you think this is going to lead to a big increase in a lot of these kind of like government overreach cases.
Yeah. So So one really hard question in constitutional law right now has to do with surveillance of publicly available information. So, there are all these cases involving, your privacy rights when the government wants to knock down your door and search your home, or wants to search your phone, or wants to look at your diary, right? Like, these are all situations in which you have private information that you don't want to disclose, and the government is asserting a right to get it, right? We have lots of law on those questions. But increasingly, what these private companies and the government want to do is not knock down the door to your house and search your house, but just vacuum up all of the publicly available information about you, right? Including what you yourself post on social media, but a lot of stuff that you don't even know you're making public, like your, so many people neglect to turn off the defaults on Spotify or on Venmo, or, there's all sorts of information that you think is private that's actually public. And then there's just stuff like, you're walking around on city streets, and that's public, right? And there are cameras everywhere. And somebody who can tap into all those cameras suddenly has access to all of your movements over many months or many years. And, we have become accustomed to dealing with these kinds of issues as privacy issues. But they're not really privacy issues here, or not privacy issues in the same way as, you would think of the government knocking down the door to your house. But they still seem to, they pose the same kinds of risks to people's willingness to engage in protest or speak candidly to one another. Like, there's so many things that will be chilled if this kind of surveillance becomes the norm and is put beyond the reach of the law, right? Like, you're not, I think that, when we go to protest, I don't know how many of you have, been to political protests, but if you go to political protests, my assumption has always kind of been that there's it's like, I know that I'm in a public space, and in theory, somebody could be tracking that I'm there, but I kind of assume that I'm safe and I have a degree of anonymity, And maybe that's naive. Today it might be naive. I don't think it was naive 20 years ago. But all this new technology is really testing that, that idea of that kind of safety, right? You're increasingly, wherever you go, there's a record that you were, that you were there, and that record is available both to private corporations and then to the government as well. And that's a huge, it's a huge issue that I feel like I've said this now to 3 different questions. But it's a huge issue that we haven't figured out how to deal with. And in fact, in the United States, like, unlike in every other major democracy, we don't have a general privacy law, which should be viewed as a scandal. Like, in every other democracy, they have a general law that restricts what the government can collect and restricts what the government can do with what it does collect. And we don't have that in the United States. We have these little targeted laws directed at things like your video rental history. That is private. But we've kind of moved beyond that that age now. We need a comprehensive privacy law that we don't have.
Yeah, we're gonna have to have a whole nother talk about that, because that's a whole. I want to see all the hands up still left to go, because I have like 3 questions, and I got 1. I'm just trying to see. So we got 4. Okay, wait. I know both of you, so I just want to make sure. Is there someone? I'm gonna get to all 3 of you, but is this? Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Gray. I'm a sophomore government and Spanish major. So we've seen that courts have recently been striking down some of this administration's anti-free speech actions, yet the judicial process, as you mentioned, is slow. It takes time to develop new law, and in the meantime, there's a chilling effect. So I'm wondering how you view the role of the courts in remedying violations of free speech, and to what extent we as citizens should rely on them to do so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I've actually been impressed by the district courts, federal district courts, over the last 18 months. So many district courts have written really powerful decisions rejecting the Trump administration's most aggressive attacks on free speech. And those district court judges, some of them were appointed by Democrats, some of them were appointed by Republicans. Like we at the Knight Institute, have this big case where we've challenged the arrests and detentions of students who were involved in pro-Palestinian advocacy. And we won that after a trial in Boston over the summer. And the judge who presided over that case, his name is Judge William Young. He's 84 years old. He was appointed to the bench 40 years ago by President Reagan. And he wrote a 130-page opinion, completely outraged by the Trump administration's policies, basically saying that he had never seen before in his time on the federal bench any case in which it was so clear that the government had unconstitutionally targeted people on the basis of their political viewpoints. And there are lots of other judges across the country, again, both Democrats and Republicans, who have written those kinds of opinions. And it's a big contrast to me. Like, I started off as a lawyer in the years after 9/11. I went to the ACLU in 2002 and litigated a lot of national security cases in those early years. And it was impossible for us to get district courts on our side. The courts were just so deferential to the Bush administration. Just over and over again, we felt like we were presenting the most powerful facts. Like, we were representing people who had been tortured in CIA black sites, or people who were being held without charge or trial, or family members of people who've been killed in drone strikes. And we just presented these powerful facts over and over and over again, and the courts over and over and over again deferred to the Bush administration. And I was worried that that's what we would see now, but it's actually been just the opposite. I think over time, even the deference that the Trump administration was getting in the first few months, it's not getting now, because judges have seen that the Trump administration, that their lawyers are not reliable. The lawyers are the facts that the lawyers are asserting to the court are often not true. And courts have seen that now and aren't giving the government the deference that it would otherwise get. So I think the district courts are doing a great job. I think as you go up, like once you get to the courts of appeals and the Supreme Court, it looks a little bit different. And thus far, the Supreme Court hasn't addressed any of the First Amendment questions. I think it will have a chance probably next term to address some of these questions, and we'll see what it does.
Okay, so we have 8 minutes. We have 3 questions. Oh, now I see a 4th. Plus, if Kelvin wants one, I have one if we get time. So you basically have 30 seconds of question. You think you can do it? Okay, let's see how
For
many
sure.
we can go.
Yeah.
Or we can actually, why don't we do, you want to pull an Anthony Romero, where they ask all the questions?
All the
and then
questions?
Okay.
I can never remember the questions. Just
Okay,
do them one at a
really-
time. And I'll do
okay,
it
really
quickly.
fast.
Yeah.
We've got Tommy, Sonia, Nate. Yeah?
All right. Thanks for being here. We've had a lot of talk about what's going wrong, but I was wondering, what do you think makes you hopeful for the future of free speech in America?
One thing, there are many, but one is this case that I mentioned where we won before Judge Young in this trial involving the pro-Palestinian protesters. In order to bring that case, we needed to convince non-citizens who were here in the country to talk about the chilling effect that these arrests were having on their communities, on them and their communities. And to go to we were talking to faculty, to go to a non-citizen faculty member and say, look, we know you're scared, but we want you to testify against ICE. You can imagine how those conversations went. But eventually, we got half a dozen faculty members from across the country to be witnesses in federal court against the very agency that they were terrified of. And they all gave such powerful testimony about why they were willing to do this. Like they all said like essentially the same thing, which is that I didn't want to do this. I'm really scared to do it, but I have a family here. I care about this democracy. I feel like it's my obligation to do it. And it was such a powerful thing to see, to see these people willing to take those kinds of risks for the communities that they had made for themselves here and for this democracy.
Do you want to jump in now?
Yeah.
Okay.
So where do university institutions sit in the conversations of free speech, and how can they educate their students on this discourse?
So universities are kind of trustees for the speech of their students, for the speech of their faculty, right? In the same way that media organizations are kind of trustees for the speech of their journalists and the speech of their readers or listeners, right? And that's part of why it's so important that those organizations stand up when they're, when they're threatened, because when they surrender, it's not just that this university, Columbia, for example, is surrendering. It's that Columbia is not defending the rights of, it's not defending the rights of its students or its faculty. They're sort of failing as trustees. And that's why I think, we need to find ways to pressure these nominally powerful institutions, universities, media organizations, law firms that have been threatened as well, cultural institutions. We need to find ways to pressure them to stand up for the First Amendment, because it's not just their First Amendment rights that are at stake.
Great. We're going to go to Nate and then Sonia.
Thanks. Nate, thanks for coming out here. I'm going to cut it short. Can you evaluate the Citizens United decision? And
Thank you, Nate.
Exactly. And is there a pathway to challenge it via setting a new precedent?
So I'm not actually an expert on campaign finance. You should ask Alison this question after. Yeah, but I don't like that decision because I think that it's very attentive to the rights of the speakers, the people making campaign finance donations, or the people engaged in political speech, but not attentive to the democratic implications of inequality in the speech environment. And that's kind of a much bigger trend in Supreme Court case law, that the Supreme Court is not concerned about equality of access to public discourse. It's only concerned about the rights of speakers, and I think that's a mistake. And I think that we're in an era now where economic equality is so extreme that it's going to be harder and harder to pretend that we are living in a functional democracy, because the people with these vast sums of money are going to be able to dominate every conversation one way or another. And it's hard to pretend that that is a society in which everybody has an equal voice.
Okay. Sonia, and then I'll ask the last question.
Hi, I have a question about today's Supreme Court decision to essentially gut the Voting Rights Act and allow legislatures to strategically redraw districts before voting in the midterms. Do you see this decision as an attack on the freedom of speech? And if so, why is the Supreme Court not seeing voting as a form of free speech?
That's a great question. I think that voting should be seen as not just a form of free speech, but the most important form of free speech that democratic citizens engage in. That is not the way that the Supreme Court has dealt with these questions in the past. I don't know what the chances are that it will sort of change its ways anytime soon. I think reform in this particular area is going to require at least a Congress that is concerned about the implications of decisions like the one that came out today, but might even require a constitutional amendment, because to some extent what the court is doing here is interpreting the Constitution, not just interpreting the Voting Rights Act.
Great. Okay, my last question is, you made a point about how you try to stay principled in thinking about the First Amendment. One of the things at the ACLU, people would say, it's a partisan organization, and we would point to the fact that we would go after Obama constantly. It's just that progressives didn't care right? That we were doing it, but they didn't care. And so we think a lot about in this space bringing different perspectives so that we can expand our thinking. But how do we escape or avoid just thinking that the government administrations we don't like are the ones doing the wrong thing? Like, how do we stay principled? What do you do? What is your North Star? Who do you keep around you? What do you read? Help us. How do we do that as well in our thinking?
Yeah. So obviously, at one point I went to law school. I didn't like law school, but there's one thing that I got from law school that I think is a very useful skill, and you know, a lot of people go to law school develop this skill. Like, to be a good lawyer, you have to inhabit the arguments on the other side. Like, not just kind of hear them, but you have to like really live with those arguments, think about those arguments, and make them, at least in your head, in the most compelling way you can. And I feel like that has been, that skill has been sort of central to everything that I do. That, you know, when I'm, partly because I want to write a good legal brief. And in order to write a good legal brief, you have to answer not just the arguments on the other side, but the best version of the arguments on the other side. And you know, you can't do that if your first reaction is just sort of categorical rejection. You have to listen carefully, and then you have to actually sort of imagine making those arguments. So that's one good thing that I got from law school. But I'll also say that, you know, for me over the last 15 months, like the hardest set of issues has been this set of issues around pro-Palestinian protest on campus. And I run this institute that has about 35 people, and I would say that on the whole, the staff is pretty liberal. You know, it's a ranges from progressive to liberal with a couple libertarians, you know, on the end. But on this particular issue, there's a real diversity of views, and everybody felt really, really strongly about their views, and everybody felt that, and still feels like their views are informed by their moral, you know, they're sort of, their views reflect a kind of moral vision. And so when somebody disagrees with them, it's not just that it's an intellectual disagreement. You're offended at a much deeper level. But the thing that I'm really proud of this decision that we got from Judge Young, this case that we won after trial. But the thing that I'm actually most proud of over the last 15 months is kind of holding this group of 35 people together, because we had a lot of hard conversations about these issues that could very easily have gone off the rails. But I think that there was just a basic trust among these people who had worked together for a while, already, and people were willing to listen and did listen, and we were able to find common ground on so many different things. And in fact, we put out several statements that were very critical of Colombia's decision to call in the police, for example, on the encampment in April of 2024. And that statement and all the statements we issued relating to pro-Palestinian protests on campus had the unanimous support of the staff, even though there was a real diversity of views on the Middle East, the conflict in the Middle East. And yeah, I mean, I feel like I learned a lot from being around other people who were good participants in that kind of discussion. They were tolerant, thoughtful, good listeners, and it was a good model for me.
I really didn't pay him to say that. But that seems to be the perfect way to end a semester of In the News, where we are trying to bring conversations and different perspectives and encourage us all to have conversations even when they sometimes get uncomfortable. So I want to thank you all for an amazing semester. I want to thank you, Jameel, for joining us here.
Thank you.
Calvin, thank you so much. And have a great rest of the semester, and we'll see you in the fall.
Thanks, Allison.
Good job.